it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off the cages out and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 39 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or a follower, or we'll provide one-time support on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The website will be in the subscription section of this podcast. All right, welcome everybody. I hope you all had a good week. Y'all, that's a Southern term. So I hope all of you had a good week for the non-Southerners. It is, you definitely feel winter coming on here, so that's nice. So nice change. So we are going to go into the three main articles this week. The West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 22. NASA announces delays for the Artemis II and Artemis III missions. And nuclear warfare policy, Cold War to today, the introduction and part one to a new series. All right, so here's another series I've been writing for 22 volumes, the West Philippine Sea Newsletter. Minor skirmish in last week in the Scarborough Shoal. And the point of this letter is that there is a definite trend for the Chinese leadership when Chinese leadership is going overseas for some type of international conference, high-level Chinese leadership like Xi Jinping or the foreign secretary or their defense minister, when they go overseas, it tends to be for like some type of summit. The Chinese go to being on their best behavior. So, and my theory is they do this so that the international press is not forced to ask the Chinese leadership uncomfortable questions for something they may have done, and in this case, in the West Philippine Sea. So obviously there's ongoing Chinese sovereignty disputes over the South China Sea, which includes the West Philippine Sea, which comprises, the West Philippine Seas is the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines in the South China Sea. So they just have renamed it, redesignated as the West Philippine Sea, which I actually think is a appropriate way to identify their EEZ. So the Chinese claims have been declared illegal by the UN. I know many of you that have listened to me and read this letter are aware of that, but I'm just saying this for new listeners. So the been ongoing disputes all throughout the, pretty much since nearly the beginning of President Ferdinand Marcos's term. Going into this week or last week is the month of November was a very quiet month for the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Coast Guard and the People's Liberation Army Navy in the South China Sea. That includes in and around Taiwan, with Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines, which is the subject of this letter. There were some issues, but nothing major, no major disputes, no using of, in the case of Vietnam and Philippines, no using of water cannons, no beating of fishermen, no trying to interdict the Philippine Coast Guard or the Vietnamese Coast Guard, no attempts to arrest fishermen between Vietnam and the Philippines. So November was a relatively quiet month. So what was going on in November? Well, as predicted, Chinese Premier Xi Jinping had an international trip. He was going to Peru to visit a Chinese investment of a $1.3 billion addition of a deep water port in Chiquay in Peru. And this is part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And I think Xi Jinping referred to it as the 21st century Silk Road is how he referred to it. We won't go into the the issues of Belt and Road and what it's signing up for countries that sign up for these investment dollars, because everything's not free, and this isn't influencing um, strategy of the Chinese. But then again, you'll see it with the United States, you'll see it with Japan, you'll see it with other countries throughout the world. They do use investments to buy influence. Well, maybe not buy influence, create influence in across the world. The Chinese are trying to, one part of their focus for one of many types of focus is South America, and actually the European Union is looking at that too, to counteract the Chinese involvement in South America. Well, on top of, after visiting Peru, he also went to Brazil to participate in. Once he went to the port, then he went to the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. I had to write that name down, in Lima, Peru, and visited with the continued having meetings with the leaders of Peru. The next day, he flew off to a state visit with Brazil with the president there, the left-wing president, who is very cooperative with the Chinese, to the point that the Chinese and the Brazilians have basically merged their Ukraine peace plans, which for the most part have not gone anywhere and probably will not. But they merged their two plans together to work together. And of course, Brazil and China are both part of BRICS. You could say that Brazil is aligned more with the Russian and the Chinese side of BRICS, where they want to create more of a polarization in the world, an anti-Western stance, where other parts of BRICS is wanting to stick to non-alignment. I would put India as the leader of the non-alignment faction of BRICS. Well, anyway, so they were meeting. There's a lot of the Brazilian leaders have in common with China. And then from there was the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro. Okay, we're not going to go into about Rio de Janeiro. They thought it was going to be the G20 summit might have been an opportunity for a pushing of the Ukraine peace talks. That did not happen. But the point of the G20 summit is, in this article, is that is why the month of November was relatively quiet. Now, why I state that is that I mentioned earlier, is the Chinese government is very sensitive to criticism from foreigners in particular. They're also sensitive to criticism from domestically as well, but they do not want to have their meetings. These are publicity events for the Chinese government. It is scripted. They do not want something that they don't necessarily control, meaning the international media, to follow them or to badger them with questions about maybe something controversial they did, like beating a Vietnamese fisherman with iron rods, or boarding Philippine Coast Guard ships with axes and spears. They don't want that following, because that would look bad, and that would be an embarrassment to the Chinese leadership, who is very concerned about their reputation. Everything is well scripted, well curated. This happened when at the ASEAN meeting in Laos, they did the same thing. They were quiet for about 2 or 3 weeks. They came up with a settlement with the Philippines over the Sierra Madre and the reprovisioning of that outpost by the Philippines. So it is a standard practice of the Chinese to do this. So again, just playing to the script. Well, November comes and goes. The media is more than willing to be compliant to the Chinese, not to challenge them, because that's old news, and they don't want to bring that up, and they don't want to necessarily lose their even limited access to the Chinese marketplace as far as maintaining a media presence in there or in China. So they're not going upset. They are more than willing to play along with this charade. Well, November comes and goes, and here we are. It's December, and China has started up again, this time in the Scarborough Shoal, which they've done several times with the Scarborough Shoal. So, again, as normal, China claims the Scarborough Shoal as their own because they claim the entire South China Sea based on the 9-dash line, that this is all their sovereign territory based on some dubious historic claim. By the way, again, I brought this up, but this is for new listeners, that if the world used the logic that the Chinese used to create this historic claim over the South China Sea, which they didn't start claiming until it was discovered that there's large oil and gas reserves there on top of the fertile fishing grounds, and about $5 trillion of international trade flows through that area. Before that, Chinese did not care. So they conjured this weird historic claim based on the 9-dash line that the South China Sea is sovereign territory of China. If we use that logic, you would find that most of the oceans in the world would be sovereign territory of the United Kingdom, based on all the activities of the Royal Navy for the longest period of time. So even if let's say the Chinese dubious claim over the South China Sea predates the operations of the Royal Navy in the world of exploring the new world and mapping the world, the Royal Navy ranged and extended their reach, including bases and islands and logistics chains that maintain their presence in this area. They have just as strong and maybe even stronger claim to most of the world oceans and seas than what the Chinese do with the South China Sea. So you don't see the United Kingdom enforcing such claim because, first off, it would never be recognized, but you don't see the Chinese using the same logic to apply to the United Kingdom. So I thought that was just an interesting twist about their weird claims over the South China Sea, which again includes the West Philippine Sea. So there was an incident because, again, Xi Jinping is safely at home, so they can go start stirring up the crap storm in the West Philippine Sea. Plus, the weather has gotten slightly better as well. That had nothing to do with November. That was actually going back into October. So the incident occurred in the Scarborough Shoal, which has been a significant flashpoint in the past. Well, the Chinese Coast Guard used their high-pressure cannons against a much smaller Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatics ship, Aquatic Resources. I think that's what it means. Basically, the fishery ship of the Philippine government was on patrol along with the BRP Teresa Magbanua, which most of you know that from the past. That was another ship that was suffered the ire of the Chinese Coast Guard as well, having been rammed and having been cut off. Well, anyway, the high-pressure water cannon was used against the Philippine fishery government ship. Also, that smaller ship was rammed by the Chinese Coast Guard. The BRP Teresa Magbanua was in the area as well. The Teresa Magbanua is the biggest of the, and there's two because they're made by the same company of the same category. It is their biggest Coast Guard ship, was on patrol with the Bureau of Fisheries ship, but the Magbanua was not impacted. It was no water cannons or ramming this time was used against the Teresa Magbanua, but the Teresa Magbanua was shadowed by both the Chinese Coast Guard and the People's Liberation Army Navy. Now, that is an issue, and we'll come back to this shortly, but that's something to be remembered, is that we're starting to see more activity of the People's Liberation Army Navy. The accusation from the Philippines Coast Guard was that the People's Liberation Army Navy warships did maneuver to not get into contact, but they came within 300 meters of the Teresa McManawa and had were accused of using aggressive maneuvers to basically cut off the course of the Teresa McManawa. Basically, it can't get all the details, but if the way I read it is it was trying to force the Chinese or the Philippine Coast Guard ship back in towards the more numerous Chinese Coast Guard vessels as well. So it was basically they were cutting off the ability of the Teresa McManawa to have rite of passage in international waters. Again, the Chinese say that they are the sovereign. The West Philippine Sea, South China Sea is all their sovereign territory. Well, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, as can be expected, defended it by stating that the Philippines were encroaching on, quote, China's inherent territory, end quote. Okay, big surprise, and said the CCG's, Chinese Coast Guard, actions were, quote, lawful and professional, end quote. So apparently, ramming and water cannoning a Philippine ship, government ship, is considered lawful and professional. So this is just typical statements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and you also often read of similar statements from the Chinese Coast Guard spokesman. China further advised or warned the Philippines to, let me check my note here, stop its infringement and provocation and refrain from challenging China's firm determination to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. That again goes back to the illegal claim that the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea is sovereign territory of the Chinese government. And that has been, again, rejected by international tribunals using the UN's law of the seas. Okay, so that was nothing unusual. Of course, the Philippines government, like it is typical with them, is they do come with cameras, and they are able to well document the cases of Chinese activities and aggressions in response. There's usually plenty of international press involved because you're going to get some good footage of what the Chinese are up to. And that's part of the Philippines strategy under Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is to highlight and expose to the world what the Chinese are doing in the West Philippine Sea. So, the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, Mary Kay Carlson, an ambassador, works for the State Department, protested the incident on X and gave a mild chastising to what I would describe as a mild chastising of the incident. Now, the fact is, why would a ambassador to the Philippines use X to mildly chastise the Chinese? Seems like a very, very weak response. And this weak response is something that does cause concerns with the Japanese and the Philippines over how committed the U.S. is. Now, I mentioned earlier that the use of People's Liberation Army plan warships were used again, or were in the area and had actively participated to shadow and to maneuver to block the options for the Philippine ships to use. So they didn't use water cannons, they didn't ram, but they were obviously involved. The U.S., when it came up with when the issues of the sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea were being, we'll say, litigated in public opinion, because there was no international tribunal that the Chinese will participate in, because they say any international tribunal or court is trying to determining the sovereignty of the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea is automatically invalid because the Chinese have already settled the issue. This is their international claim based on history, a weak history. So there is no international tribunal. But the U.S. stated that until this is some type of negotiated settlement over the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea are done, is the U.S. has said that People's Liberation Army Navy warships are not to be used in the enforcement of these claims. Otherwise, the U.S. may have to respond. Now, the idea is that the U.S. says that, okay, using the Chinese Coast Guard is allowed, but have also been silent on, Chinese Coast Guard is allowed to be used. The PLAN is not allowed to be used to enforce these claims. And the U.S. is completely silent on the use of the Chinese maritime militia, which acts as an auxiliary to the Chinese Communist Party in both the local and national leadership, and to sometimes assist the Chinese Coast Guard, basically adding more eyes and ears. It is leveraging a large part of the Chinese fishing fleet to be the eyes and ears of the Chinese government, where not every ship of the Chinese Coast Guard and the People's Liberation Army Navy can be. The Chinese Coast Guard is the largest Coast Guard in the world, but it is not near as big as the Chinese fishing fleet, most of which can be influenced and drafted into serve for the maritime militia, which again, I've written about that before, about the gray zone tactics. So the reason why this is important is because the U.S. does have a defense treaty with Japan and the Philippines, two separate treaties. They're not joint treaties. Japan does have has been increasing its security arrangements with the Philippines. It's not up to a defensive alliance, but there are bilateral agreements between Japan and the Philippines as well regarding defense. So there's a U.S.-Japan defense treaty. There's a U.S.-Philippines defense treaty, and then there's Japanese-Philippines defense treaty. So these are separate, not interconnected, though they do interconnect with each other because the common factor is Philippines do have alliances with both Japan and the U.S. Again, not a tri-party alliance, but three separate bilateral agreements. The U.S. stated that the People's Liberation Army Navy is not allowed to enforce the claims or the disputed claims in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea. The People's Liberation Army Navy has been becoming more and more involved in Scarborough Shoal. This time they had 4 warships in the area. There was the long-running incident with, I mentioned earlier, with the Teresa Magbanawa of the Philippine Coast Guard, where it dropped anchor in the Scarborough Shoals to create a presence to watch the Chinese activities, because the Chinese had been apparently trying to create an artificial island like they've done in other parts of the South China Sea in the Scarborough Shoal. So the Philippine government decided they were going to keep an eye on the Chinese activities by permanently putting the Teresa Magbanawa there. This was protested significantly by the Chinese government, and eventually the Chinese were able to keep any type of resupply from happening on Teresa Magbanawa. She was forced to retreat. There was, I can't remember, seemed like it was dozens of Chinese Coast Guard ships at the time that Teresa Magbanawa finally retreated, but there were 7 People's Liberation Army Navy warships in there. So the U.S. says that that in the Philippine claims, or the Chinese claims in the West Philippine Sea, cannot involve the People's Liberation Army Navy. There has been 2 distinct incidences, and there's more, of the People's Liberation Army Navy serving as an auxiliary to the Coast Guard and the maritime militia. their presence is in the area in a territorial dispute. The one thing that the U.S. said under the current administration was not to happen. So they warned the People's Liberation, the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, that the People's Liberation Army Navy is not to be used in these disputes. Well, there is been two incidences, and all that comes from the U.S. of any major significance is a mild chastising on X from the ambassador of the Philippines. Now, I get she is the ambassador. She's not, of the Philippines. She is not the ambassador to China, and she doesn't directly, she doesn't speak for the state like Anthony Blinken in the State Department, or you could also go with because of the defense treaty, not speaking for the Pentagon as well. Basically, the U.S. has they did state later that they protest the actions, but they did not really. It was very mild. Now, it is true that the current administration is outgoing, and they may not want to handcuff the incoming administration with their policy, but I don't think that's true because they didn't do that in the Ukraine. They actually have increased the aggression in Ukraine, even when a new administration's coming. So I don't think it's a case of the U.S. the outgoing administration trying to handcuff the incoming administration. I think it's just a general showing of weak leadership. And if the U.S. wants to have weak leadership over protests of the West Philippine Sea, that is fine. But they should never have made the statement that warning the Chinese not to use the People's Liberation Army Navy. And when they do, the U.S. does basically nothing. So a lot of with the defense treaty is the Philippines are going back and stating about the defense treaty, and that the Chinese cannot be too aggressive because there is that defense treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines. And they've already started, both countries, U.S. and Philippines, have started laying out outlines of what could possibly trigger the U.S. defense treaty with the Philippines. And there is ongoing discussions with that as well, because the Philippines are in the strategic interest of the United States, especially in regards to any operation against Taiwan. So this is where the issue becomes, where it becomes a problem is, okay, the Philippines are relying on some form of deterrence based on the defense treaty with the United States. The U.S. has affirmed that defense treaty with the Philippines and have warned China to that effect. The idea is deterrence, telling the Chinese you can only go so far and you're only to be using your Coast Guard in disputes. Otherwise, the defense arrangement with between the U.S. and the Philippines, which is one of the longest defensive alliances in the U.S., actually I think it might be the oldest, is that will come into effect. So again, it's based on deterrence, telling China don't do this or this will be engaged. So again, it's based on deterrence, not nuclear deterrence. This is just normal deterrence based on this defense agreement. So China goes ahead and just flagrantly ignores the use of the PLAN. They've been creeping up on there using the People's Liberation Army Navy, and when they can do it, and the U.S. is not responding. So this erodes deterrence. So now it creates a situation where the Philippine government questions, is the U.S. really committed to this defense alliance? And the Chinese are pushing is, will the U.S. really do this? And this goes back into ideas of how far is the U.S. willing to stick up for, in the case of China, is let's test the American resolve. If the U.S. is not willing to back up its word that the PLAN is not to be used in these disputes in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, but when the Chinese do something, all you get is a protest on X and no real dispatch. So that leaves the Philippines, and by extension, the Japanese, wondering how committed is the U.S. when push comes to shove. This has always been a criticism of U.S. policy going back to the Cold War and what NATO and Western Europe. So it does bring a legitimate question: is the U.S. doesn't seem to show a real resolve in being willing to back up its word. It's very much like the Syrian red lines under the President Obama administration use of chemical weapons that eventually allowed the Russians to be involved in the Syrian civil war. If you don't back up your red lines, it is you can do it a few times, but eventually it erodes your deterrence ability, and the allies start questioning whether you're really committed to this, to protecting this country as you stated you would. I mean, the U.S. Responding to protect the Philippines. Go into red lines about Russia and the Ukraine war as well, but this one's about red lines being used against the U.S. and nothing happens. Now, I would say that these are not hard red lines like what you've seen in Ukraine that Russia's laid down, but they are conditions that you are not to do this, meaning China, you are not to use your People's Liberation Army Navy warships, and they do, and all you get is a protest on X with nothing else really, no stringent pushes by the U.S. on this. So it really creates a question is, to the Philippines, it's how committed is the U.S.? Now, the Philippine government under Marcos is willing to push these claims and not let go of the sovereignty claims. And he does have confidence that the U.S. Will back him up. And to his credit, and maybe this is some of the back-end discussions with the U.S., is that he is willing to take the lead on these pushbacks against the Chinese government. And there is some constitutional law within the Philippines that require him to do that. About the part of their constitution where they're not allowed to be, foreign countries are not allowed to be involved in wars that the Philippines have. But that is kind of open because the fact they did sign a defense treaty with the United States, and they do have a less, it's not as fully committed as the Philippine U.S. defense agreement, but there is also the defense agreements between the Philippines and Japan. So it kind of questions about that law. But so this is one of the problems is the U.S. is, okay, if they stated that they were going to say People's Liberation Army Navy is not to be used, but the People's Liberation Army is used anyway, and Navy is used, and the U.S. does basically nothing, again, it erodes deterrence. So will the Chinese feel emboldened to push harder in the West Philippine Sea using their Navy, and are they willing to translate this to how far they push in Taiwan? Now, we do have an incoming administration, and one thing you find with Chinese government is they do try to test what a new president will do. The Soviet Union used to do basically the same thing with new presidents as well. So it'll be interesting to see how far they test on this. Are they willing to become more aggressive by pushing their Navy in the West Philippine Sea with disputes with the Philippines, or are they willing to back off? The wild card in this, of course, is President Trump has already been president, so the Chinese may not feel the need to, or the appetite to press to see how far they can go with President Trump because they've already gone through this before. So the other option that the Philippines could do if they're not going to get initial backing from the U.S., they're again backing the U.S. over the use of the People's Liberation Army Navy warships becoming more active in the disputes, is maybe the Philippines adopt a gray zone tactic of their own, where the Chinese have the maritime militia, that maybe the Philippines start using their fishing fleet and maybe some NGOs like At NITO to enforce its lawful claims, create a presence, set themselves up to basically dare the Chinese to act out against Philippine civilians and create a international incident or force China to back down to avoid an international incident. So it's maybe something, I'm not necessarily suggesting this is a good idea, but the idea of using gray zone tactics that the Chinese use is it challenges the established authority to act against civilians and then create an international incident that they can use to leverage either public relations, which would most likely be the direction that the Philippines would go, or to justify armed action. So I've written about this before, so I won't go into the full gray zone tactics and how it could be used, but maybe since the Chinese are basically the occupying power, and it's disputed because the Philippines keep going up and still putting ships and fishermen in the area to not just give up their claims to China. They keep sending ships and they're fishing ships as well into the region, but may basically treat China as the occupying power and dare them to act out against civilians. Again, I don't know if this is something the Philippines want to do. There has to be a political appetite for it. There would obviously have to be backing from the Philippine government, just as the gray zone tactics that are used by China do specifically have the backing of the government. So maybe the Philippines could look at adopting some variation of this as well. So, and the final word is that as long as China does not breach the first island chain, the Philippines will remain relatively protected from the worst responses from China, even without the defense agreement with the U.S. China cannot act out overtly. So the U.S. is trying to avoid an entanglement by setting this mild red line of not using the People's Liberation Army Navy and don't respond when the Chinese flagrantly ignore it. I don't think China can really push to the point of destroying Philippine government ships or killing Philippine sailors or Marines and not require some type of response from the U.S. and the defense agreement, which I tend to think that it's something that they are really trying to avoid. The U.S. is trying to avoid at this point. Maybe China as well. But weakness is only going to promote them pushing the boundaries of how far they can push the Philippines. Again, the Philippines are still relatively protected as long as the first island chain isn't breached and the U.S. at least gives some firmer support, and they need to back this up a little bit. I'm not talking about starting to shoot at Chinese ships, but they need to start backing up what the U.S. If the People's Liberation Army, if China is not to be used, the People's Liberation Army Navy to enforce claims in the West Philippine Sea, then the U.S. needs to do something when these breaches come up, whether it's stronger patrols, the U.S. Navy shadowing the People's Liberation Army Navy as well, the U.S. Navy adopting more radical, aggressive maneuvering of its own to block People's Liberation Army Navy warships from being involved. Not sure what that would be, but something has to respond. Otherwise, it negates or greatly erodes U.S. deterrence in the region in regards to the Philippines. And again, Taiwan and Japan are watching it because Taiwan doesn't have defense agreements with the U.S., but they do with Japan. And I say Taiwan because Taiwan's under threat, and they're under some hope that the U.S. will act as a deterrent factor to keep the Chinese from invading their island. So I've written about that extensively as well, so you can read those. So I won't try to rehash those. Okay, number 2 article for this week. The NASA announces delays for Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 missions. No real shock there. Again, this is just revisiting some of my favorite topics, move away from geopolitics to talk about space, which again, something that interests me quite a bit. I go back to a kid and the Apollo missions. So the Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 missions were the NASA missions to go back to the moon. Artemis 2 was supposed to do a a circumnavigation of the moon, basically go around the far side of the moon. And it was actually going to be on the farthest side of the moon that any manned spacecraft has ever done. And then Artemis 3 was actually supposed to return to the moon. Artemis 2 mission was supposed to be in, let's say it was 4 astronauts, 3 Americans, 1 Canadian, was supposed to take place in September 2025. And then Artemis 3 was supposed to occur sometime in 2026, and this was a landing on the moon. Now, Artemis 3 definitely seemed like it was, its timeline was in danger. So I wasn't surprised that it was delayed. SpaceX needs more rapid testing of Starship to be able to, because the lunar landing is supposed to be a lunar version of the SpaceX Starship. The FAA has been dragging their feet to the point that SpaceX can build new Starships faster than the FAA is giving license approval. So this was going to cause problems for NASA because if SpaceX isn't allowed to test their rockets, because that's just the way SpaceX does something, is they'll send it up and they're willing to fail to learn something, then iterate on the ground like you see with Blue Origin and NASA. So it's going. The administration has already announced that there will be a 25 launch schedule license for next year, or starting this year all the way through 2025. So through the rest of this year and to the end of 2025, the FAA has already approved 25 launches. But SpaceX is already behind on in the impression of where they need to be for the 2026 original Artemis 3 mission. And then also simple things like there is no longer a suitable spacesuit for lunar missions. SpaceX has and Boeing have both created suits that are adequate for flight. SpaceX has tested a upgraded version of their spacesuit that's used in Crew Dragon that allows for spacewalks, tethered spacewalks, but allows them to do spacewalks. It looks like the same thing could be with the Boeing ones that are used on Starliner, can also do that. And then obviously NASA has older spacesuits, but they do have the older spacesuits that can be used as spacewalks as well. None of these companies have a current spacesuit that is capable of walking on the moon. Again, the U.S. has not been to the moon for 50 years. Spacesuit technology has increased, so they can't. So it's not really an option to go back and try to bring back the Apollo moon mission suits. They're basically going back and trying to recreate the wheel. Well, that's not available. They've been COVID put them behind on making a spacesuit. So it's the funny thing is that Artemis 3 mission, let's say SpaceX is ready to go, NASA is ready to go, Blue Origin is ready to go, because Blue Origin hasn't flown anything yet either, and they will play a role in the Artemis missions. I think they'll have limited role in Artemis 3, but they will play a role in future Artemis missions. So even if SpaceX was ready, even if NASA was ready with the Orion spaceship and the SLS, NASA's still going to go to Artemis 3 because they wouldn't have a spacesuit available for them to walk on the moon. So the extra time to 2027 will probably give SpaceX more time, give Blue Origin more time, give more testing for SLS. So the reason for the postponement, though the postponement I think for Artemis 3 was going to happen anyway, mainly based around the spacesuit and the delays in SpaceX's Starship program, is the ablative heat shield of the Orion crew capsule suffered more damage in, again, it's ablative, it's made to wear away, but apparently there was uneven wear and higher than normal areas of wear where there was basically, it almost looks like, call them gouges. A crew still would have survived on the Artemis 2, or I'm sorry, the Artemis 1 mission, it would have been able to survive. And this is the second reentry for a Orion crew capsule. So it took more damage than what was expected. Again, this is the second testing of Orion. The first was where it was launched into a high Earth orbit using the Delta IV rocket from ULA. The second one was using the SLS, which was the first Artemis mission. Artemis 1 descended around the moon and back. Heat shields take a lot more pressure, so they have to be much more sturdy than what it is for a reentry from low Earth orbit, because this is carrying velocity coming back from the moon. So the heat shield has to be able to withstand more on a lunar mission than it would on a low Earth orbit mission. So they found some issues with the ablative heat shield on the Orion capsule. So that is the official reason is for NASA announcing the delays, is they want to go back and rework the Orion ablative heat shield. Again, it survived in Artemis 1. It survived in the original test launch. A crew would have survived with this, but it is just a little too much risk than NASA is willing to accept with manned spacecraft, and is understandable in that perspective. Disappointing, but understandable. And again, I did not think Artemis 3 was going to happen in 2026. So it's been pushed off to sometime in 2027. Artemis 2 has been delayed from September 2025 to April 2026, subject to change, of course. So prior to the announcement for the delay is the Space Launch System, SLS, which is the moon rocket for NASA. Again, this is NASA, not any of the commercials. This is a government rocket owned by NASA. It's SLS with Boeing and Northrop Grumman, and I can't remember if it's Morton Thiokol, the company that makes the solid rocket boosters. They're the same as the ones that were used on the space shuttle, with some modifications. Well, the SLS is being stacked in preparation for the Artemis 2 mission. They are going at the Kennedy Space Center, so they're going to continue stacking operations, even though it has the Artemis 2 mission has been delayed. And the stated reason is that they want to continue with integration testing between the SLS rocket and the Orion capsule that sits on top of it, along with the service module for the Orion capsule that is created by ESA, European Space Administration. So they want to continue with that integration spending. So originally, if the SLS was to launch in September, there would be no issues. Now, so the thing about the stacking operations, they're going to stack it, they're going to test it, which is, testing is always good, but the solid rocket boosters are only rated to be put together for 1 year. So at some point, NASA is going to have to unstack the SLS system, even with the solid rocket boosters, and they're going to have to restack again. So there's going to be an additional cost at some point, because if they were going to launch in September as originally expected, they would have a 3-month window, maybe probably closer to 4-month window, before they had to take apart unstack the SLS rocket and have to go back and either get new solid rocket boosters or have to have those ones reworked and then stacked back together, put back together and put back onto the SLS. So integration testing will continue, but at some point it's going to have to be unstacked and restacked to cover the April 2026 launch date. So that's an added expense, and this is all about expenses. I get into talking about the SLS. The challenges with the SLS is, and this is idea was, it's a massive rocket. There's the current one, it's called the SLS Block 1. They've had bigger iterations of what eventually became SLS, of having a much bigger rocket than when you're seeing an SLS, but it was very expensive. So, but NASA was trying to create a rocket that could get them back to the moon. Well, the more expensive versions of the Space Launch System, which I think was the Constellation rocket, well, those were all deemed too expensive. This has been going on for over 20 years. So finally, the iteration is like, well, NASA was going to use basically, call it off the shelf technology, basically reusing parts from the space shuttle and add it to the SLS. So the main engines on the SLS are the RS-25 rocket motors that are used as the space shuttle's main engines, which use a combination of hydrogen and liquid oxygen to run. And so those were to be used. And then the solid rocket boosters that are two solid rocket boosters that are used on SLS are basically the same rocket boosters or solid rocket boosters used for the space shuttle program, but they've added a middle section to allow more fuel to give it more boost in the liftoff phase. Now, RS-25 rockets returned back on the space shuttle main engines, and they were used for multiple flights, many flights, dozens of flights. So these were reusable rockets. The solid rocket boosters from the space shuttle, when they used up, they were detached from the shuttle and they parachuted and landed in the ocean, where they were recovered by NASA and were refurbished and eventually reused as well. Well, the SLS has zero reusability, none. So those RS-25 rockets, and they're using rockets that have already flown on the space shuttle. These main engines of the space shuttle are on the SLS, and when the SLS casts away its first stage, those RS-25 engines that have been used in dozens of space shuttle launches are going to meet their end by crashing in the ocean and being destroyed. So even though they're saving money on using the RS-25, two things. They're using engines that already exist, but also the SLS is saving money by not having to create new rocket engines, which would take a large development cost. So it does save money, but using engines that were meant to be reused and casting aside. So it seems like an inglorious end to these engines that served the space shuttle so well, have in many cases dozens of missions, and are now being cast aside in a single launch. The solid rocket boosters as well, these again were recoverable, but because adding the new section, these rocket boosters, solid rocket boosters, will go higher up in the atmosphere than the ones that were on the space shuttle. So NASA determined that these can't be recoverable either, so there's no parachuting system on them. These crash in the oceans and are expended after one use. So again, saving on development costs by not having to restart the wheel of creating new solid rocket boosters. They added the middle section, but basically reusing old technology. Some of these solid rocket boosters outside of the middle section that's being added have also flown on multiple flights. Now these are going to be cast in the ocean and are going to be destroyed. So that's an added expense. So you're saving money in one regard by using off-the-shelf technology, so there's no development costs, and you're using parts that were used on the actual space shuttle program, so you're not having to repurchase something new RS-25s or new solid rocket boosters at this point. You're just using what has been flown in space before, but these are being cast aside. So there's an expense there that was not in the space shuttle program. So saving in one aspect, losing on the other. The Orion space capsule is reusable, or is listed as partially reusable. The service module from the ESA is not reusable at all, but the core part of the Orion capsule is reused. The blade of heat shield, of course, has changed. Some of the, I think the jettison towers are lost, but for the most part, most of the Orion capsule, is reusable. The SLS is the only human-rated rocket capable of carrying the Orion capsule and is the only human-rated spacecraft to go to the moon. Now, NASA makes the determination of what is a human-rated spacecraft, so it is convenient for them to declare it human-rated after just one flight. But they did it, but they spent a lot of time making this rocket. And again, it is using technology that was used in the past for the space shuttle. So it's not like it's testing something completely new. It's using a lot of the off-the-shelf technology. So a lot of the testing had already been proven on the space shuttle program. So the SLS, human-rated capable rocket, of only one able to carry the Orion capsule because ULA no longer uses the Delta IV. So SLS is the only rocket for the Orion capsule. SLS is the only current rocket that can go to the moon. It produces 8.8 million pounds of thrust in its current Block 1 configuration. And to give you an idea, is the Saturn V that went to the moon only produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust. So this is a more powerful rocket than the Saturn V that went to the moon. The rocket cost, so remember, it's using, again, off-the-shelf technology, so there's no development costs. And then they're also using old parts that have already flown on the shuttle. The SLS still costs $2.6 billion to create the rocket and to launch it. So cost of fuel, cost of the facilities to put the SLS together, to roll it out to the pad. So $2.6 billion per launch. And remember, the SLS is not reusable, and this is not the cost of the Orion capsule either. The rocket is not reusable. So every time you launch, per launch is $2.6 billion gone, and it will not be reused at all. There is also an additional $1.5 billion for the remaining mission costs, totaling $4.1 billion using the Block 1 SLS per Artemis launch. And that will only go up as they start looking at adding the moon landing missions, the lunar gateway, the refueling missions that will have to be used for Starship. So the cost will go up, but then commercial is actually taking on a lot of the parts of maintaining the logistics of a moon base and the Artemis missions. So it may not actually go up as much because, as we'll see, is the commercial options are a lot cheaper. Now, SLS is the only rocket that can fly directly to the moon through flying to the moon. It doesn't have to have another rocket, does not need to be refueled. It is able to go to the moon and back, using very similar flight profiles of the Apollo missions. So the Starship Super Heavy booster is not necessarily rated to go to the moon, not yet anyway. It hasn't even gone into orbit. It is still an experimental program. It creates 17 million pounds of thrust in its current configuration. And once it is projected that once the Starship and the Super Heavy get into its into operational phase, is cost could be as little as $10 million per launch. The SLS is $2.6 billion per launch. Now, this has not been realized because the Starship and Super Heavy had not gone in there, have not flown even into orbit yet. They've done suborbital flights. But obviously, when you look at this number, that is a considerable cost savings than when compared to the SLS. Again, because unlike the SLS, Starship and Super Heavy are 100% reusable. I think right now, even the ring that's used for when it separates between the Starship and the hot ring. It's called the hot ring, but that is even being recovered right now. So, and I think they're going to discard with the hot ring, but which again is the interstage ring between between the booster and the Starship. So this is a much more powerful, right? It can launch much more cheaply and then again, the reusability plays a big factor in it. And it costs about $70 million to create right now. Of course, those costs might change. They still have to build a crew version of it. So obviously the cost will go up in probably creation. But you're talking about a category right now is talking about $70 million to make per unit when they eventually get there. $10 million per launch. It can be reused, launched multiple times, compared to $2.6 billion for one SLS. So obviously the scales of the Starship Super Heavy, which again is still experimental, is not human rated yet, but it is also playing an integral role in Artemis 3. So there's significant cost savings by using Starship Super Heavy. And that's why it's so important that they get the launch license so that they can get into a human rated activity. Now, when I say the SLS is the only rocket that can take off, launch from Earth, and go all the way to the moon and back and not have to require any type of additional actions. Starship will have to be refueled in orbit. So let's say it is $10 million to launch. Well, then you have to launch a refueling Starship to refuel the Starship that's in orbit. So that's another $10 million to launch. But let's say I saw something that to go to the moon was, I think they're talking about multiple refueling. So let's say it is multiple refueling. So that puts you at $30 million to launch. And let's say the worst case scenario, you use 3 Starships at $210 million, at $30 million. So you're at $240 million. You're still a tenth of what one SLS is for the configuration. So this is where the scaling of Starship comes into, if it can ever be realized, of how much cheaper it is than SLS. So, and then we have gone to Blue Origin as well. So the Trump administration is coming in, and the Doge project, which is the go back and review all the waste in the government. These scales that I just stated are immense, and SLS has been questioned by multiple administrations about its cost effectiveness. It's been delayed, so if Artemis 2 was well into its phase to be launched in 2026, Artemis 2 would probably be safe, and possibly Artemis 3. But by delaying now, it's going to bring up the SLS back into budget considerations in Doge. Now, I did say in the article that Doge is going to be run by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Well, Elon Musk owns SpaceX, he owns Tesla, he owns the Boring Company. So there is some type of, there will be a conflict of interest. I've stated that Vivek Ramaswamy probably needs to be the one to look into the SLS program, because it is going to be looked into, because just the fact of launching one rocket is $2.6 billion, and launching a Starship is considerably less. Now, launching a Starship to the moon is more complex because there is refueling operations that have to occur both in Earth orbit, and my understanding is will also have to happen in lunar orbit. So again, it's a much more complicated system for Starship to do it, but it can do it on a much cheaper basis than SLS. So SLS is going to get reviewed, and there was, from again multiple administrations, a lot of skepticism about SLS. Now the problem with SLS is it's the only one that can carry the Orion capsule to the moon. Yes, Starship will be able to go to the moon And there will be a lunar version of the Starship that will release from the lunar gateway to the surface of the moon. So so SpaceX does plan to go to the moon, and Blue Origin is already working on plans to do resupply missions to the moon using the New Glenn rocket, which is nearly as big as SLS. Not as big, but nearly as big. But they don't think it's not able to launch the Orion capsule, nor is the Falcon Heavy, which is basically three SpaceX Falcon 9s strapped together. Very much looks much like the Delta 4 rocket. So maybe they can modify the Orion capsule to fly on this mission. So the cost coming there is SLS is going to be scrutinized significantly because of it's just so costful, and it is so wasteful when compared to other options. Because New Glenn from Blue Origin is also, its first stage is going to be reusable, and they're working on options for the second stage. But right now, it's the first stage is reusable, so it's going to be cheaper than SLS as well, and nearly as big. Super Heavy, SpaceX Starship and Super Heavy are bigger than both and 100% reusable, and so much more cost effective. So there's really going to be the questions: is it really worth continuing on with SLS? But if you don't go on with SLS, there is no ready option with the Orion capsule. And right now, SpaceX does not have a human-rated spacecraft, and Starship is not rated for human uses either. And you can't use the SpaceX's Crew Dragon to go to the moon. It's just not capable of doing that. And you can't do that with Starliner either. Neither were built. Heat shields were not built for this because remember, you have to have bigger, more significant heat shields that enter into Earth coming from a lunar mission than you do from low Earth orbit. So those aren't options. So if you scrap SLS, it is a fairly high likelihood that Orion would also have to be scrapped, and that would leave just Starship as the most likely one to be human rated somewhere in the near future. Or you have to heavily configure New Glenn or the Falcon Heavy to accommodate the Orion capsule and the service module. There's no way that Starship and Super Heavy can be modified to carry the Orion capsule. Even if you just use Super Heavy itself, it's just not possible. It's completely wrong configuration, different materials used. It's just not possible. So that's the only options. So, and it's not even questionable if it's even possible. So if you cancel SLS, you have a better than 50% chance you're going to cancel Orion too. Those are all sunk costs. Would it be cheaper to at least get some benefit and stick with Artemis 2 and 3 and go to the moon, and then look at canceling future Artemis missions, or cancel SLS and go with other options for after Artemis 3? That's going to be the big question. So, and the reason why is this important is because there's just like when the U.S. Agreed to, or set a policy to, an unofficial goal to go to the moon before the end of the 1960s, promised by President Kennedy, to beat the Soviet Union to the moon. The U.S. has stated that they want to beat the Chinese to the moon. The Chinese are stating they will be able to get to the moon by 2030. It's not an ambitious schedule, so it almost seems like that's probably a doable feat by them. Feels very much like the Apollo program is how they would have to follow. So I don't know what rocket they will use or what technology they will use to get there. But the Chinese say that they are going to be there in 2030. The U.S. says they want to beat them to the moon. And so this really comes into the question is, yes, the SLS is extraordinarily expensive, prohibitively expensive. it needs to be reviewed, and something needs to occur to either scrap SLS, which I hate to say because again, I'm very interested in space. I'm very interested in the idea of going back to the moon. It just seems so wasteful when there appears to be other options that will cost the taxpayers much less. But there's no way Starship and Super Heavy could be ready. There's no way New Glenn could have, and Blue Origin and New Glenn could have an option to go to the moon. So here's the problem, is if the SLS is scrapped due to its cost, the U.S. could possibly be Chinese to the moon if it becomes a national priority, and that means pouring money into into Starship and Super Heavy and New Glenn, which was probably going to be just as costly as the money that you've spent already for SLS. So it'd almost be the cheaper option is let SLS go for Artemis 2 and 3, and then possibly scrapped after that. Because if you want to beat the Chinese to the moon, you have to go with SLS. If you want to save money and save the taxpayer money, which is a laudable goal, then SLS has to be scrapped. And you're not going to beat the Chinese to the moon because there's no way SpaceX and Blue Origin can be ready to get to the moon before 2030. And if they did, it would cost more than maintaining the current SLS configurations. So the cheapest option right now seems to be, cheapest option is scrapping SLS and letting the Chinese be the second country to reach the moon. And basically, you're just giving up your unofficial goal to beat the Chinese to the moon. Not a national tragedy because, again, we've already been there, but I understand trying to beat the Chinese to the moon because you don't want the Chinese, South China seeing the moon. So that is a concern. So either you keep SLS and you have a realistic chance to beat the Chinese to the moon, or you scrap SLS to save money, go to the commercial options, but they will not be ready by 2030 to reach the moon. So either you beat the Chinese to the moon or you scrap SLS. Yeah, you really can't have both. So it has to be a decision that has to be made. A lot of the money spent for Artemis 2 and 3 have already been spent, or a large portion of it. If you scrap them, there's also the sunk costs of about between Orion and the sorry about that. It's whatever the national priority is going to be, because again, SLS and Orion have already spent $50 billion. If you scrap it at this point, again, it'll cost more than $50 billion to do a national priority program for SpaceX and Blue Origin. So it seems like either completely scrap trying to go to the moon with SLS and Orion and come up with a new option that's cheaper. Commercial options do look cheaper, but you will not beat the Chinese to the moon. So again, we've already been there, so it's just a matter of priority. So it'll be interesting to go. If it wasn't for the delays, this would not have been a discussion. It most likely Artemis 2 and 3 would continue as followed, and then government cutting would probably have looked at Artemis 4 and beyond. But now that you've delayed for a year, now it's up for debate. It's going to be up for review. So, okay. So the next article, last one, is Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Introduction in Part 1. This one is a new series of, it won't be written every day, but it'll basically be like the West Philippine Sea newsletter, where this is more on the historical background and how it could apply. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it goes into the policy of the position of um, with nuclear war, like how does nuclear policies, history of it apply to today? Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes where we are today has led to where we've been into the past, and just basically maybe creating a story about how you get there. And the reason why I did this is because obviously nuclear threats and changes in nuclear policy have become in vogue with the Ukraine war, with the constant threats. Oh, I would say constant. The common threats by Russia to use nuclear weapons, them advertising or publicizing when they change their nuclear policy, and what would allow for the use of nuclear weapons. So this is so I, having been grown up in the Cold War, obviously not um, as knowledgeable as, well, if you want to say I'm knowledgeable. I'm not as knowledgeable back then as I was today, but the world grew up basically from Truman's administration, probably after 1949 and the Russian nuclear bomb, first nuclear bomb, is there has been a threat ever increasing until the end of the Cold War, to the point that there's 51,000 nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And when the Cold War ended on December 25th, I say the official date was the ending of the Soviet Union on December 25th, 1991. The treaties that were signed by both President Reagan and President Bush with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev were starting to go into effect, that were going to greatly reduce both strategic and theater level nuclear weapons. And also, because the Cold War had ended, a lot of those tensions had lifted. So there was still going to be threats of nuclear war, between like a regional nuclear war between, let's say, Pakistan and India when they had their tensions in 1998. And between the two countries, they had 11 underground nuclear tests to one-up each other to show off, which also included India claiming, actually both countries claimed hydrogen bombs as well. But so we knew that regional nuclear war was a possibility, and that's why nuclear nonproliferation was a big deal. That's why the Budapest Accords were signed with Ukraine to get rid of their nuclear weapons, to be able to diminish the idea of a regional nuclear war. So it was a national policy to reduce the nuclear weapons. So you saw both the Soviet Union and Russia adopted all those Soviet treaties to reduce nuclear weapons significantly, not allow each missile could only carry one warhead. So there's all types of ways to start bringing down the amount of nuclear weapons, and now the amount of nuclear weapons have declined significantly. Well, this was a real chance to say, I'm not necessarily saying that it has to be nuclear disarmament, because there are always going to be countries like North Korea, the rogue state, that's going to have nuclear weapons for whatever purposes, because it is a major deterrent having a nuclear weapons. Countries definitely have to rethink how you're going to escalate against a nuclear armed adversary, which is one of the concerns that I've been expressing about the war in Ukraine. Well, the issue that we've had is, like, as a world, we had an opportunity to really change the course of nuclear war and actually get to the discussion points of severe use of nuclear weapons, severely curtailed nuclear weapons. And now we've run into with the I'm not talking about the current administration. I'm not talking about necessarily past administrations. I'm talking about as a whole, that after the Cold War, the caliber of leadership in the world seems like it has really declined, where they did not seize the opportunity of finding a way to push um, a policy that didn't bring back nuclear weapons at the forefront. And now we're seeing ourselves in that world. You have obviously a rogue nation, which was always going to be feared with having, that's why nuclear disarmament has never been a serious discussion topic for Russia or the United States. Um, and then obviously you have India, Pakistan, they used nuclear weapons as a deterrent. Is that obviously nuclear disarmament was going to occur? It was the weapon of last resort. Um, but you didn't need to run into an aggressive nuclear policy. You did not need to base your defense policy around nuclear weapons. And now we're getting to that point where those discussions are, where in the world, I'm not saying U.S., but for the most part Russia, but the U.S. is probably responding as well, probably not publicly, is it's changing nuclear policy, where the idea of when nuclear weapons can be used, and is extending beyond just the first use of nuclear weapons. So that conversation is coming in there. So I always talk about the action-reaction cycle. Well, if the Russians are changing their nuclear policy, the U.S. would have to respond in kind. So it's kind of that what you saw in the mentality is, well, the U.S. doesn't want to have a policy that is that's ill-suited for the new policy by the Russians, which is driven by the Ukraine war. So we've basically driven ourselves back into these nuclear conversations. You have President Putin of Russia routinely threatening the Ukraine, the West. I mean, you can call it specific countries. He's called out nuclear attacks on, threatened nuclear threats against United Kingdom on a regular basis, the United States, Germany, Poland. I think Finland's been thrown in that, Sweden as well, just trying to threaten the new members of NATO, kind of a form of intimidation. The French have responded in kind, saying, well, if you have nuclear, we have nuclear weapons too, and we'll use them, and ours are in a higher state of readiness, which may or may not be true, but the French doesn't have near the number of weapons that the Russians have. And then you have now the Chinese, who during the Cold War, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union had all these weapons, the Chinese basically maintained basically I think what they called it basically a deterrent level force. They did not have enough weapons to destroy the world, but they had enough to basically keep deterrence, protect their country. Again, nuclear weapons have a significant deterrence factor, which is also a concern with these red lines of the Russia, is that you're cutting into that what has always been historically deterrence level, where nuclear powers don't push each other this hard. Have we crossed that threshold in the Ukraine war? Pretty close, if we haven't passed it already. You saw the U.S. experience during the Korean War. The U.S. talked about using nuclear weapons in North Korea to end the war. There was discussions to use nuclear weapons to protect Taiwan, discussion of using nuclear weapons in Vietnam prior to the major engagements in Vietnam of the late Kennedy and the Johnson and later Nixon administrations. Conversations before that. So yes, nuclear weapons have been threatened before, but it has been something of the past, and it's coming back. And it's not just the Russians threatening it. For example, the French have been public about it. The French are saying it's the action-reaction cycle. The French are reacting to what the Russians are stating. And having read the history of nuclear policy, is you can bet that the U.S. is changing their policies as well to react to the Russian policies. So I always said that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and it seems relevant today. So that was just a little bit. I'm not going to go into it, just about the introduction to the series. This will not be a replace all my Substack articles. I may not even publish one once a week, but it will be an ongoing topic about the development of nuclear war policy and nuclear use policy, which we seem to have entered into this time period. Now, I also, in this series, I am not going chronologically. That would have been, I think it would not have garnered a lot of support or a lot of attention or readership. Even the first one that I created did not create that much leadership. It's definitely behind, about 25%, performing 25% less views than my standard article. So it may not be a particularly popular series, but I think it's also a very interesting theory. And maybe some will get the conversations as we see more and more nuclear threats, is how a lot of this ties back to the past. And these are things we've crossed before. So the first one I came into, I started in the middle of the beginning of the Carter administration, basically the first 7 months of his administration. And it was under something called Presidential Directive NSC, National Security Council Directive number 18. And it was a shift in strategic nuclear policy. Now, I only used one document, and that was a former top secret document on there. The link is in the paper that I have, and still got the top secret view in it, and it came from a public CIA archive. So it's not something I went and pulled or anything like that or stole. It's on the CIA website. It's on other multiple websites. It is funny. The CIA one looks like it was put on a. It was in like a 2-ring top binder, and they just took it and photographed it and flipped a page and photographed it and flipped a page. I think the total document's only like 5 or 7 pages long. And the part about nuclear war, this was basically a summary. This was not a lot of detail. It was basically setting a directive for the for future nuclear policy of the Carter administration. So Jimmy Carter took office in January 1977, and it was during the period of detente, though it was probably waning at the time, but we were still in a period of detente where there was reduced tensions. There was nuclear treaties like SALT I had occurred, Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty, which wasn't really, it's a limitation treaty. It did not actually reduce weapons. That didn't really start coming until the START Treaty, which was under President Bush, also President Reagan with the intermediate banning of intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe as well. But then you had the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, where severely curtailed the use of anti-ballistic missiles, where I think the only anti-ballistic missile systems could only be used around the capitals. That was created. So there was generally a determination to find a way to limit the arms race, but though actually SALT dramatically increased the number of warheads. So, but at least they were talking. It's more than you can say about the U.S. and Russia now. So the prevailing document in the 1970s and before was all the way back to the tripwire of the Eisenhower administration, is mutually assured destruction, or sometimes I think it's referred to as nuclear equivalency. Basically, well, actually, they're different. Mutual equivalency is basically both sides will keep relatively the same number of nuclear weapons. Mutually assured destruction is a policy that if you start a war, whether conventional or nuclear, and that policy's changed, and we'll discuss that in some of the future ones, is mutually assured destruction is if you attack us, we will destroy your cities. Basically, it's holding each other's populations hostage. to nuclear destruction. So if you act out in a nuclear launch a nuclear attack, we will guarantee that we will destroy your as well. So basically, it's a no-win situation, but both sides destroy each other. And so that's mutually assured destruction is that was the standard policy going back to the Eisenhower administration and tripwire in Western Europe. So in the late 1970s, it was getting to the point that it was dissatisfactory for both the U.S. and the Soviet Union that their only option with these strategic nuclear weapons was blowing up the world. They obviously nuclear weapons were considered strategic nuclear weapons was considered a leverage for both the Soviet Union and the United States for power plays. So the Carter administration went in there and they actually started forming policy of what other options do they have with strategic forces. So NSC 18, again, was a top secret document, and it was had a number of sections to it. And I think, well, I don't have it up, but you can read the article about it. But the one area of interest to it was where I talked about that the MAD, mutually assured destruction, was the primary doctrine going back to the Eisenhower administration. This NSC 18 actually put the U.S. on the course to not have other options for the use of strategic nuclear weapons other than just destroying the world or destroying the Soviet Union. And actually, when you look at the PSYOP, is even during MAD, it would have attacked things outside of just the Soviet Union. So the strategic force objectives of NSC 18 was to maintain U.S. nuclear strength to stay relative equivalency to the Soviet Union and to deter attacks and non-nuclear escalation, which is one of those areas right now we're kind of playing with, is the non-nuclear escalation, because again, the strategic force objective, when they say strategic force, that is nuclear weapons. Think of it as the nuclear triad of the U.S. To stay relative to the Soviet Union, to deter attacks, both nuclear and non-nuclear. So the presence of a strategic nuclear force was meant to deter non-nuclear escalation. And that is something we're creeping into in this world today. So the directive established that the U.S. position under the Carter administration is that he wanted to maintain an equivalency force with the Soviet Union, which supported the MAD doctrine. But under the policy, it's a 3-sentence part of the document called the Strategic Targeting Policy. And the directive requested a review and update of U.S. nuclear targeting plans if deterrence failed and a nuclear conflict begins. The targeting plan was aimed to limit the damage to the U.S. We read that as allowing a U.S. first strike and its allies, and deliver an unacceptable amount of damage to the Soviet Union and force a termination of nuclear exchange on terms most favorable to the U.S. So I wrote that part down. So the idea is aimed to limit damage to the U.S. The only way you're going to limit damage to the U.S. is a first strike. Hit them before they can hit you. And then we won't go into launch on warning or anything like that at this point. So if you're going to try to limit the damage to the U.S. and its allies, that means first strike. So it became a open policy in the administration. Again, this was a top secret document, so it's open within the administration, but not to the public, that the U.S. would, if the situation was right, would allow itself the first use of nuclear weapons. The idea is to deliver an unacceptable amount of damage to the Soviet Union. And the idea is, the policy was, there was two policies at the point of NSC 18, and one was called Counterforce, and the other one was I think it's Counter Value. I'd have to look at that. But basically, it was the idea is Counterforce is to go after the nuclear weapons assets, and the other policy is to go after the cities and the populations. So this strategy that was being adopted now was where MAD was just go after the population, just destroy the population, just destroy what makes a country, which is its people and its cities. And that's the point of the MAD doctrine. Well, now you're talking about with a limit damage to the U.S. and its allies by delivering an unacceptable amount of damage, not an ending amount of damage that would be in mutually assured destruction, is an unacceptable amount of damage to the Soviet Union. That means something less than an all-out nuclear exchange, which I think they referred to as a nuclear spasm, which actually is a good idea. It's basically under MAD, you launch everything you have and you see what happens. And you can understand from a political perspective of, yes, that is a true deterrent force, but if you don't want to get into a war where the final objective is just destroy everything in one big shot, maybe you want some other option. The idea is that you didn't fight a nuclear war under mutually assured destruction. It just happened and societies ended and nuclear winter and all that. That was the true deterrent effect is if you try to destroy us as a world, we will destroy you. And we both won't exist. And that was the true deterrence is, if you want to be around as a country, you don't win, we don't win. But, if you cherish what you have, you won't have it anymore. And that's the whole madness of mutually assured destruction. But now you're talking about this point, you're talking about the idea of actually fighting a nuclear war. You don't fight a mutual war under mutually assured destruction. You didn't fight a nuclear war. It just happened. Everything was shot off, and the world as we know it, at least in the northern hemisphere, ends. Well, now what you're talking about is a directive that sits there and says, and it is aimed to limit the damage to the U.S. and deliver an unacceptable amount of damage. That's not talking about it's unacceptable, not to the point of everything being damaged. It's now you're talking about degrees of damage. And when you're talking about this point, enforce a termination of nuclear exchange. So that means all of a sudden you decide that you're actually going to fight a nuclear war. And if you're going to fight it, you're fighting it to win it, because force a termination of the nuclear exchange on terms most favorable to the U.S. And then the other part was to create a secure reserve force. So this reserve force, where the idea is the U.S. first strike and to create an unacceptable amount of damage to the Soviet Union, that was counterforce. That was going after the strategic assets of the Soviet Union. Strategic assets meaning the nuclear weapons. And then there would be a force continuum on top of that. But that originally is to create an unacceptable amount of damage through counterforce. Destroy their capability to attack the U.S. And you have to do that through a first strike. And then the idea was to create a secure force. And the directive says that U.S. targeting plans should maintain a secure reserve force for potential use after a major nuclear exchange. This reserve force was to provide a counter value force specifically meant to target Soviet cities and their populations. At this time in 1977, the submarine-launched ballistic missiles lacked the accuracy of the ICBMs. So what was happening is the ICBMs and the bombers were to deliver the counter force response to the Soviet Union, and the reserve force of the U.S. submarines and probably the bombers as well that survived was to hold the cities hostage. um, basically saying, we will destroy your cities, whether all in one shot or one by one by a force continuum of maybe going after economic targets and then maybe cities. So that goes into the point of is that reserve force. So at this point where, again, MAD, you launch a nuclear attack and a spasm attack where you launch everything and both sides just destroy each other. And that's the deterrence is if you want to survive and go forward, you can only go so far because we will destroy you with your nuclear weapons. And we know that you will destroy us. Now, President Carter, with this directive, is basically committed the idea of the U.S. fighting a nuclear war and starting setting objectives. And now this opens up because the idea is that you're talking about force continuum, because before it didn't really matter. It was just launching enough nuclear weapons to destroy your enemy. Destroy their population. You can't have a country without a population. There's not a lot of math involved in that. Just create enough nuclear weapons and you just go at it and you destroy each other. And both countries were following an idea of equivalency, and that's what caused an arms race, is that they wanted to make sure that neither side had a real advantage in the number of nuclear weapons. So this now is that President Carter had sent, did the earth-moving decision to change U.S. policy to mutual assured destruction of a nuclear spasm to actually fighting and winning a nuclear war. Now, I did say, and I think listening to some of the people that were involved in this policy discussion at the time, is winning was a relative term. These were still going to cost tens of millions of casualties. A lot of these weapons, especially air bases, could be close to population centers. So you're still talking about millions to tens of millions of casualties, just not hundreds of millions of casualties. So winning is a relative term. And this was not just the U.S. The U.S. was more public about it, even though this was a top secret document, like all things in Washington. Things shift. It became a real change in U.S. policy that actually was getting to the point of thinking about fighting a war. And later in the earlier parts of this document, it talked about President Carter, because he signed this document personally, he stated that there is technological advantages, economic advantages of the U.S. to leverage in this type of policy. So we'll discuss that later. But this is one of those things, ground-shaking doctrines, and you can guarantee that the Soviet Unions were thinking in the same directive, because the Soviet Union were building very deep bunkers to house their leadership. So they were thinking in the same terms, and also with their weapons, multiple use silos for ICBMs. Basically, you launch and then reload. So the Soviet Union were thinking on this term. So this is not just necessarily the evil West doing this. This is also a consideration of what the Soviet Union was doing. Now, President Carter did state that he wrote this in response to U.S. intelligence gathering of Soviet activities. I suspect that's probably that the belief is that the Soviets were looking at the idea of how to win a nuclear war, how they could survive MAD, or how you could prevent MAD from occurring. Now, MAD was always left in the option, because when you look at attacking counter value, that's basically MAD. So the idea was the two legs of the triad would do the counter force, and then the submarine base would do the counter value. Is you give in to our demands to end this war, or we will destroy your cities. But it would also be vice versa. So this doctrine, and how many people really heard of it? I've really had to study it. How many people have really heard about NSC 18 signed in August 1977? But it introduced into official U.S. policy for for the U.S. policy to pursue how to fight a limited nuclear war and create a doctrine based on that. So that is what the first topic of discussion is. Again, it's not proven to be very popular. I guess people don't want to read about the past. That's fine. I will keep writing about it because the evolution of nuclear war and how we got there, how we started pulling back from the brink, and how we're finding a way to get back to the brink. And not all parties have weapons. We don't have nearly as many weapons. Neither do the Soviet Union. The Chinese have more. Chinese are pursuing a peer status with the United States and Russia, so they will be more aggressive. So we'll have to consider a world with 3 major nuclear powers instead of just 2. All right, so that is my discussions for this week. We recorded papers. There will be more, obviously, on the West Philippine Sea newsletter, because I write about that as an ongoing but not weekly series. And now I'll have a nuclear warfare Cold War to Today series that will not necessarily be weekly, but will be an added discussion point. Again, not in chronological order. Maybe someday I'll put it all in chronological order, but right now it's just going to be as things of matter of interest and not start up with the dry and mundane stuff of creating Lawrence Livermore Lab and stuff like that. So that is it for this week. I hope all of you had a great week. Thank you for all my new supporters and subscribers and followers on Substack. It is greatly appreciated. Substack added two new options this week to change the text to read function in the app, where you always have the option of using the AI in Substack where it can read the articles I print. So you have now multiple voices you can use. Not a great feature, but also they allow for linking directly the videos from Substack to YouTube. So it saves me a little bit of time, but YouTube has absolutely throttled me. I'm probably 99% down on what I was in October. Probably call it end of September, early October. I was probably getting, call it West Philippine Sea newsletter could get 2,500 to 5,000 views a week, when especially at the heightened parts of the Balakatan exercise, down to most articles were getting about 400 views per article. So I was getting probably, along with the shorts, I was probably getting 1,500 to 10,000 views per week, which is not a lot on a huge platform. But again, in comparison, now I think I've gotten 6 views on YouTube this week. So they've added that new connection with Connect Substack to YouTube. It'll be interesting to see if that changes the algorithm. I did upload my first video using that functionality on Substack, so we'll see what it does. I'm not really expecting a lot, and at this point, I'm just maintaining YouTube and Rumble and Locals more as placeholders if I decide to expand more into video podcasting or something like that. So that is it for the week. Thank you, everybody, for my existing followers and subscribers. Thank you for sticking with me and all the great feedback. And new subscribers and followers, welcome, and I hope you'll be back next week. We will talk to you later. Bye.